Hey, what's up guys, Guardian here, and come you guys with a deck profile today on my updated Phantom Blaster Overlord deck, technically now. We have evolved from Phantom Blaster Dragon to Phantom Blaster Overlord. So, yeah, Overlord is pretty cool. It's changed the deck up quite a bit. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get stuck in, and I'll show you guys what I'm playing. So, to start with the right deck, of course, we're playing Full Bow for the starter, just the typical Shadow Paladin ride line starter. And then for the grade 1, we're going to be riding into our Blaster Javelin. So, of course, with him, when you ride your Dark on top of him, you look at the top of your deck, and if that card is a unit card, you put it on the rear guard as rest, and if it isn't, you discard it to the drop zone. Every card in the deck is a unit card, so you're pretty much going to get a 3+1 when you ride your grade 2, which of course is going to be our Blaster Dark. So Blaster Dark, of course, when he's placed on Van or rear, you counterblast one and retire another rear guard to choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it. And then he also gets drive +1. But do remember, he only gets the drive on the Vanguard circle, and if he's on the rear guard circle, you'll only get the drive check if you get the over trigger. So do bear that in mind. And then he has a continuous skill of whilst on rear guard. During your turn, if your rear guard was retired this turn, this unit gets 5,000 power, which is actually really, really good now because we can synergize that with the ability of Phantom Blaster Overlord. So, Phantom Blaster Overlord, what does he do? Well, his first skill is that if you have Phantom Blaster Dragon in your soul, he gets a continuous +1 critical. Yes, very, very deadly skill. Very, very good. But his second skill is that when this unit attacks, you pay the cost of retire 2 rear guards, choose a Blaster Dark from your soul or your drop, call it to the rear guard circle, and then if your opponent's Vanguard is a grade 3 or greater, that unit that was called and the Overlord get 10,000 power. So this is actually pretty good because if you're going second and you go into your grade 3, your opponent's already at their grade 3 Vanguard, which means you're going to get a 23k Phantom Blast Overlord and a 25k Blaster Dark. Both of which are able to get over defensives, and that's pretty cool. And also, this enables us to do multi-attack in the deck now, since we can poke with a rear guard and then retire that rear guard to then bring the Blaster Dark out later. So yeah, so really, really cool design, and I do like what they've done with Phantom Blaster Overlord. So that is it for the right deck. So to go into the main deck now, we are of course playing the 3 additional copies of Phantom Blaster Overlord, just so that we can Persona ride, of course. I definitely want to be doing that when we can. So 3 more copies of him. And then next, this is the bit where it might be a bit contentious with people. I'm only going to do 3 copies of Phantom Blaster Dragon. Now, the main reason why I want to do 3 of this was because 4 kind of felt too heavy on it. I didn't like the idea of getting the one that I need into the soul, and then knowing that there's 3 other cards in my deck that more or less don't do that much. So I kind of didn't like that. And also with this deck, I feel like 3 is acceptable just because I've designed the deck to be more rush orientated, much more in the early game, so that we can get a lot more pokes out and then not rely too much on the critical effect from Overlord. Since you're attacking so much in the early game, and then you have the multi-attack skill of your PBO to then hopefully close the game out. The critical effect is nice, and it does come up at a good amount of times, but it's not necessarily the end-all be-all of the deck. It's more like the cherry on top of the deck that can just close games out a lot more quicker. So, yeah. So I decided to just go for 3 Dragon, but if you do want to play 4, that is also fine as well. So, to go into the grade 2s, we of course have the return, a very popular unit of Skullwitch Nemain. So, Skullwitch Nemain, she gets 5,000 power as long as you've got a Blaster Vanguard, so she becomes a 10k attacker, which is pretty nice, and she does have a base power of 5k, but she has a rear guard skill of when she's placed on the rear guard from anywhere, if your Vanguard's clan is only Shadow Paladin, you can pay the cost of Counterblast 1, put a card from your hand into the soul, then draw 2 cards. So this is really, really nice. The one thing that PBD was looking for a very long time was generating card advantage, and we finally got there. We have a plussing engine now with Nemain, and also it gets you the Dragon in the Soul very easily to get that critical effect from your PBO, which is very, very nice. So definitely be playing 4 copies of this. Very, very nice card, and it's nice to see Nemain back. Now, for the next grade 2, this is kind of serving a similar purpose to the main. It's 2 copies of Drilling Angel. So Drilling Angel, the main reason for this is that its ability is that when it's placed in the rear guard, you can put one of your unit cards from the drop zone into your soul as the cost. And then you look at 3 cards on the top of the deck, and you look for a copy of the card that you put into the soul. And then, if you do see a copy, you can call it to the regard circle. So it just randomly gives you a +1, which is nice, but the main intention with this card is that you will have another outlet in your deck that can get your dragon into the soul for you for the critical effect of PBO alongside your domain. So now we have 6 enablers to get the PBD into the soul now, which is pretty nice. And also there's a slight other element with this card that I like, in that once you've used one of your domains in your deck and it's in the drop zone, you could actually intentionally soul charge the domain to look for more copies of this from your deck and then potentially get more card draws out of it. When it's placed on the regard from anywhere, it actually does work with the angel, since it does call it from the top 3. So that's actually pretty cool. So yeah, 2 drilling angel, I think it's a nice tech choice, and it goes alongside the domain quite nicely. So next with the grade 2s, we are playing 2 copies of Blaster Dark. So I actually have my own reasons for playing 2 in the deck. So at my locals, one of my friends plays an Eva deck, and if you're unfamiliar with the Eva deck, it has a way to bind one of your rear guards, which in this deck, when when Blaster Dark is like the most important rear guard in your strategy, if the right deck one gets bound, you're kind of screwed, to be honest. So I did want to include more Blaster Darks in the main deck, but the reason I went up from 1 copy to 2 in the main deck was simply because the game that my right deck one got bound, I had 1 more in the deck, but I hadn't seen it. And I then found out later it was actually at the bottom of my deck, which was pretty unlucky for the most part, but having the 2 copies in the deck makes that less likely the case. I'm at least able to see one of them more likely. So I don't have to fear that bind too much. So I am catering this a bit more to my local environment. So if you do want to edit this and take maybe one of the darks out for the 4th copy of the dragon, I'd do so. So that's fine with me if you want to do that. But I personally like the 2 dark in the main deck. And also, he's not too bad in terms of attacker, because he will be 15 after you do the retire with PBO. And then if you put an 8k booster behind that, he can reach 23k, which is pretty good to get over a defensive. So I think he's got a place in the main deck, but whether you want to play like 1 or 2, that's completely up to you. So yeah, so 2 copies of Blaster Dark in the main deck. And then the last grade 2 is going to be 2 copies of Camlos. So Camlos I actually really like. So he's kind of like one of the rush enablers of the deck, which is pretty cool. He'll be coming down on the turn 2, and he says, when he attacks, if your rear guard was retired this turn by your Vanguard's ability, you can Soul Blast 1, and then this unit gets 10,000 power till the end of the battle. This is actually pretty good, because if you go into your Blaster Dark, you're actually going to be retiring the call that you get from your Javelin, which means you've technically retired a rear guard with your Vanguard's ability. So that will enable your Camlos to get that 10k power, and being a 20k beat stick means that you can get over a defensive when your opponent's at a grade 2. So that's actually pretty cool. But even outside of that, he's still just a 20k beat stick in the late game, so he can still come up there when you're doing your PBO strategies, which is nice. But one thing that I was okay with dropping this down, because I was originally playing this at 3 before I put the 2nd copy of Dark in the main deck. The reason I'm okay with 2 though is because there are times where, since this deck is very heavily focused on the grade 1 rush side of it, there is plenty of opportunity for your opponent to damage deny you to get the Count Blast that you need for Blaster Dark's retire skill. So yeah, it's a little bit clutch there, but if the opportunity does present itself, then Camlos can be a nice unit to have for that early game rush, in case you haven't seen the other early game rush cards in the grade 1s. So I think he's quite flexible, and he's quite good for the late game as well. So I quite like him as a 2-of in the deck, so we're doing 2 copies of Camlos. So moving on over to the grade 1s, we of course have the mandatory 4 copies of the Perfect Guard. Don't really need to explain these, it's just the good PG, and like I said, these will be getting a reprint very shortly in set 6, so don't worry too much about that. And then next, okay, this is the this is the meat part of the deck. So first of all, we have 4 copies of Mugen. So Mugen is probably the most important card in your grade 1s, because basically the idea with this is that we're going to be calling it down on the turn 1 with our Blaster Javelin, and since you've got a Blaster Vanguard, you can use her skill to discard a card. Then you look at the top 2, call them as rest. Now, they come out as rest, which is fine, because the idea here is that those 2 units are going to be restanding on your follow-up turn, on your turn 2. And you're going to be pressuring them with multiple attacks in the early game, so that when you get to your turn 3, you can start pummeling them with the multi-attack that you're going to be generating through your PBO, which is pretty cool. But the also nice thing with Mugen that's very flexible with this deck is that if you call some good bodies out to the field, that's fine. But then if you don't call good cards onto the field, like maybe you call like a trigger or 2, that's okay as well, because sometimes those triggers actually be good boosters depending on the scenario, which I'll get to later. But then also you can retire any bad calls that you get with the PBO later on your turn 3, because you do have to retire 2 reguards of them. So if you do get some bad calls with this, it's not too bad. So yeah, I really like this card, and I like the rush element that it gives to the deck. So you definitely be playing 4 copies of this. Very nice. So 4 copies of them again. And then next we have one of my personal favorite cards, which came out of set 4. 3 copies of Fire Nula. So Fire Nula, of course, it basically gets a continuous 10k power as long as there's no units in the column that she's in. So that means yours and your opponent's as well. So the cool thing with this is that it's an 18k beat stick, which means if your opponent's at grade 1, they're an 8k, which means if they get a defensive trigger, you can still hit them with the Fire Nula. So you can actually get a really aggressive turn 1 if you call down the Mugen, attack with this, attack with your Blaster Javelin for the Vanguard, and then still have the Fire Nula to attack with as well. Like, that is 3 attacks on turn 1, and a lot of the decks in Overdress, usually they actually quite like getting like to turn 3, turn 4 in order to get the ball rolling. So if you can apply a lot of pressure in the early game, you can actually dwindle their hand size really far down, or deal them a lot of damage so that you can then close it out on the PBO turn, which is really cool. But then another aspect of this that I like, along with the Mugen and the Fire Nulas, is that these are just boosters as well. Like, these are just 8k boosters that you can use to make your grade 2s a bit more powerful. Because cards like the main are just 10ks on their own, so having that 8k boost is a nice way to get over the 13k base that the grade 3 Vanguard will have at some point. So yeah, so Fire Nula, very nice. So we're playing 3 copies of her. And then the last grade 1 I'm playing is actually really cool. I underestimated this a lot until it came into practice. 3 copies of Energy Refill Angel. So, what does this card do? So when it's placed on rearguard, you can pay the cost of Soul Blast 1, and then this unit gets 2000 power till the end of turn for each of your other units. So it means, other units, so it doesn't count itself, but it does include your Vanguard. And the really cool thing with this is that in synergy with Mugen, so if you call the Mugen down, and then you get 2 rearguards in the back row, right? So now you've got 3 rearguards. Now, let's say they kill the Mugen, right? The damage deny you, they attack the Mugen, that's fine. Because when you're riding into your Blaster Dark, you're going to be getting the call from your Javelin effect, which means you'll have 3 rearguards. And then what you can do at this point is that you could then call maybe a grade 2 body, maybe something like the, I don't know, maybe the Camlos on the grade 2 turn, and then you could maybe call something like this. So Energy Refill Angel will then get a 10k power boost with you having a full field, making an 18k attacker, which, I don't know if you remember, that's exactly what Fire Nula is. So she's also a pretty good beat stick in the early game. And there are also some funny scenarios that can occur with, like, if you call, say, a trigger out that has 5k power, like this one, for example, 5k on the 18 makes 23, so that's actually a pretty viable line of play, even when your opponent is at grade 3. So you just got to keep in mind what you've got on the field and what lines you can make with the power columns. So yeah. However, we're not done with her. So the other thing in this deck that I noticed that was pretty weak was that if you're going first, when you get to PBO, one issue with PBO is that he only gets the power if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, right? So you're not gaining power from his skills, which is pretty weak, and you kind of want to make that crit pressure when it's applicable to be very threatening. And that's where she helps. She can just Soul Blast 1 and then get tons of power and then make that PBO attack just more deadly and just more pressurizing, which is really cool. And then one other aspect, I know there's a lot about this card that I love. one last aspect is the fact that with any of your 2K, like any of your, your grade 2s, you can just make really good magic number columns with them. And I suppose the last thing that comes to mind is because she's a Soul Blast effect, she can actually Soul Blast the Blaster Dark out of your soul before you then bring it back with PBO later on. So it's not much of a major thing to bear in mind, but it just makes it feel nice that you're not wasting a potential Soul Blast, and you can actually put it to use with something like this. So, yeah. I know I went a lot into it, but there's a lot about this card that I love, and I think it just meshes really, really well with the deck. But I do think it's really, really good with the Mugain line in the deck. You do need to be playing that for this to get the max benefit. So, yeah. So, 3 copies of Energy Refill Angel. Really, really cool card. So, that is it for the grade 1s. So, now we have the triggers. We, of course, are playing Amata Noah for the over trigger, just so that we can get the drive checks, and also because we have opportunities to be using Blaster Dark in this deck, because the only things in this deck that counterblast is Blaster Dark and the main, we could actually use his skill sometimes, and if you're very lucky to get the overtrigger, you could actually get that twin drive, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that's also pretty neat. So of course, 1 copy of Amata Noah for the overtrigger, and then for the triggers here, there's a bit of thought put into these, so I'll try going into them in a little bit of detail. So first we have 4 copies of Feather Dragon, and I'll suppose I'll put the other crit down as well. I'm playing 3 copies of the Disma. So, Feather Dragon's 2k power increase actually makes a difference in this deck, because if you end up calling it down from the Mugain skill, that 2k power could go to something like your Energy Refill Angel to make it a 20k column, or your Fire Nuller, because this is very applicable for when your opponent is at a grade 2, because 1 defensive will put them up to 20k. But that 2k power increase from the Feather Dragon makes these 20k, which now they can get over that defensive, which is really, really good. And you don't Soul Blast too heavily in the deck, but there could be occasions where maybe that extra soul could be helpful, but it's neither here or there. But Disma, like I said, that 5k boost that it provides can sometimes be useful, but it only really comes up with like the Energy Refill Angel, really. It doesn't really work with the Fire Nuller, just because you need to have an empty column, so yeah. So it's not as important, but we're playing 7 crit in the main deck though. I do think you can get away with 7, although you can play 8 in the deck if you want to increase the ratios of the other triggers. So, with that being said, we of course have the remaining triggers with we're playing 2 copies of the draw trigger, and I'm also playing 2 copies of the front trigger. So the reason I'm doing this ratio is because draws just feel good anyway, so if you do want to go with 8 crit, you could replace the fronts with like 3 draw, or vice versa, like 3 front and 8 crit. But the reason I went for both is because I like the draw element of the deck, but then the fronts are also nice because when you're attacking with PBO, obviously you attack with the rear guard, then you attack with your Vanguard, but then you call Dark back out, and then usually you've set up the other column to get over a defensive anyway, so that when your PBO is attacking, if you drive check a front trigger, you could just make all of those columns just 10k higher and just more pressurizing. And then, you put that on a Persona Ride turn, you're going to be hitting for some pretty large numbers. So, yeah. And also, I do like with front triggers where if you do see them on your first drive check, it can sometimes make a 2 to pass a lot more scary for the opponent, since you don't have to choose where you put the power with this. Just your front row gets the power, and then that second check could just be a regular trigger, which now you know to put it to the Vanguard, and now you break through. So, yeah. And then also, lately, the 20k shield value from the front trigger has been coming up a lot recently. Like, the amount of 1-card guards I've been able to do with this when I do have it in my hand is absolutely insane. So I do like the defensive value of this as well. And, vice versa to the draw trigger, the 10k can actually come up as well, but I also just like these for the draw power as well. So that's that. And then lastly for the deck, we of course have the heals, but yeah, with these you can sort of mess around with these to your will. So I play 2 copies of the multi-attack heal, and then 2 copies of the generic 15k heal. Mainly with this, I just like a 2 and 2 split just for the flexibility. I might even take one of these out for the new crit heal triggers, maybe just to have that on hand. But the idea with this is just to have a bit of everything for every situation. But if you do want to swap these around, you could swap these out for more of these, or whatever you feel like. Just adapt this to your local environment and what you play against. So yeah, so that is it for the heal triggers. And yeah, that's it for the deck. So Yeah, I went into quite a bit of detail with this one, but I mean, I've been doing that with the other two deck profiles as well, so it is what it is. But I do really like the rush element of this deck. It's pretty entertaining to do so much stuff in the early game, and then turn 3, turn 4. That's kind of when you're looking to like push and seal the game off and go for lethal. So yeah, I quite like the design of PBO and what they've done with the synergies that it has with Blaster Dark, and overall the deck just feels great. So yeah, that's going to do it for me. So I will put a deck log of the deck in the description below, as always. And yeah, I will catch you guys in the next video. So like always, this is Guardian 205, signing out.